I'm in the middle of watching a video. It's an interview of Dr. David Lukoff and Katie Mottram on Katie Mottram's Emerging Proud blog website that she's doing. And I listened to 20 minutes and he's sharing his story about his spiritual awakening, basically, that could have been interpreted as pathology, as psychosis, as schizophrenia. And it's really interesting because he talks about how he dropped everything to sort of travel around North America hitchhiking in the 70s, took LSD, and then had sort of a spiritual awakening experience days later. That went on for 2 months. And he talked about how during the 2 months, he just sort of crashed with friends and nobody pathologized him. He didn't end up in the psych ward. And after the 2 months, he went to live in a cabin that his parents had. That was just a summer cabin, so nobody was around, and they let him live there. They gave him permission to live there. And he lived there for a while, and then he seemed to have some scary experiences, but he was there by himself and he got through it, and again, he was never pathologized. And that just makes me think of how after my 2-month experience, I was saying to my parents, take me somewhere quiet. I need to go somewhere quiet. So I knew that I needed that same thing, but there was nowhere quiet for me to go except for the panic room in the psych ward. And so he was able to heal there. And then he said he heard a voice that said, be a healer. And so he didn't really know what that meant, so he went to go live with his parents in his late 20s, and they paid for him to take things like yoga, different psychology things, and just a bunch of different classes like that, because he was exploring being a healer. Again, they never pathologized him. They never said, you dropped out of Harvard. They never said, why don't you go get a job? They let him explore. And then after about 6 months of all that, he realized he wanted to become a psychologist. So he did go back to school. So it was a long way around to go back to school, but he ended up finding what it was he was passionate about and going back to school with that. And to me, it's exactly what needs to happen for people. And I've even told this to some family groups that I've shared with. When a person's going through a crisis, it's even more important to just be unconditionally loving and let that person explore what they need to explore. Because as Sean Blackwell said, bipolar disorder can also be called I can't be me disorder. So it's really important for a person to feel like they can start to explore and rediscover who they are and what they really wanted to do and what they're all about. And so he luckily had parents with the means to do that and the understanding, because some parents with the means wouldn't necessarily understand. And so he fully got through everything without ever being pathologized. And I think that's more of a miracle than how it usually is for people. Usually somebody pathologizes them and leads them into the psych ward or something like that. And that's what happened to me. And it's interesting because today I'm supposed to be working, but I can't really focus on work. And yesterday I made some videos in the morning, then I went bowling, then I came back home and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get some work done because there was a few things I needed to do. And I opened up the document on my computer and nothing scary, but all of a sudden I had a pretty bad amount of so-called anxiety. And so I tried to work on it for a little bit and then I closed it. I'm like, wow, this is brutal. And so I just started editing my videos, and within a little while that sensation went away and it didn't return. So I'm thinking about this whole applied kinesiology thing and muscle testing. You know, I could say to myself, oh, should I continue with this job? Yes or no, and push my arm, which doesn't work for me anyways anymore. because I could think of the job and it would make me weak if I push on my arm. But it's strong, like nothing makes my nervous system weak. So what I'm feeling like is that this map consciousness or this trans consciousness experience, when it starts happening, our whole body is responding in an applied kinesiological way. Meaning, if I'm looking at the document that is along the path of what it is that I'm actually reacting to and recoiling from, it's almost like the energy is no longer flowing. So I'm looking at it, the energy is no longer flowing. It's starting to bubble in my internal area. And so that is the applied kinesiology, not me thinking about the job and pushing my arm or doing this or whatever. It's just I'm having an allergic reaction to it, an aversion to it. It's almost like the universe is saying, go no further. And it's kind of strange. And I don't really know if that's true, but that's the main time that I've had anxiety is related to my job. And I don't know, I think it's just time to quit while I'm ahead, because I usually wait until I fall apart before I quit. And I've already fallen apart 3 times. And I'd rather not fall apart the 4th time. So I took the week off, and I feel bad because I feel like I want to be able to do that job, but it feels like the universe isn't letting me go any further. And it might actually be time for me to focus on becoming a healer myself. I remember looking at palm reading stuff years ago, and if you have this sort of hash mark on your finger just below your ring finger on your right hand, or your dominant hand maybe, that means you're a healer. It's the mark of the healer, and I have that mark. So I've always had this sense that I could become a healer. And perhaps a lot of this self-dialogue is helping to heal myself. And it's interesting because on the scale of consciousness, the lower levels of consciousness are shame, guilt, and shame. Shame's the worst, I think. And so yesterday I was having sort of like guilty feelings, and I really recognized it, and I was like, wow, my consciousness is sort of going to that place. I'm not getting taken over by it and then having one guilty thought after another. But there was some guilty thoughts. And that's usually when I'll have some thoughts and feelings in that way, is when I'm in map consciousness or that altered state of consciousness. And then today, this morning, it was very subtle, but I had some shame thoughts. And so that's arising in my consciousness, is this shame. And it was very subtle. It wasn't anything major. That's the type of thing that can spiral. One shameful thought leads to another shameful thought, leads to another, and then all of a sudden I'm not just having a thought of shame, but I'm in the state of shame. And when I'm in the state of shame, I remember last time I was acting very distressed. I was like threatening suicide. So if I let that spiral, I might all of a sudden feel suicidal, because that's one of the things that would lead me to feel that way. And so again, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like, do I really want to risk my wellness on this? I don't think it's worth it. And Dr. David Lukoff talked about how he wrote this religious book. He was trying to create a religion that united East and West. He felt like he was a reincarnation of Buddha and Christ. And I was thinking about how oftentimes these experiences make us feel like we need to save the world. It's an inner journey. It's an inner hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell said. And then we feel like we need to save others too. But really, I was thinking about when he was talking about how he wanted to create a religion. unless somebody experiences it for themselves, then it's just belief. So what I was thinking was how it's like a religious experience, it's a spiritual transformation, but it makes one a religious center, not a religion, which is abstracting about the experience one had, but to be religious, just like I was talking about how we can be a dream center, or we can be safe space, we can be a religious center without creating religion to believe in, because then it's of no value. And he talked about how he's aware of his spiritual awakening, and he's also aware that it probably would have been interpreted as schizophrenia or an episode of short-term psychosis or something like that. So he has that dual awareness, and I feel I have that awareness too. I am aware that most people would have viewed me with a pathological lens, but then there's people that would view it as something else, and I view it as that something else, from inside out and outside in. And he talked about how his crisis felt like an existential crisis. He felt like he was just being moved towards how he was programmed to be and not who he really was. And I think that's such a huge part of it for so many of us. And that's why I feel like it's a hyper-meaning state. It's starting to find meaning in other things, which maybe those are the meaningful things, and the things that we thought were meaningful are not meaningful, and that's why we sort of detach from them, and we're actually moving towards what's meaningful. And he also mentioned how he encountered a lot of different people on his journey, and think about the people I'll encounter in the mental health system versus if I take a different journey. And not that those people are bad, it's just a pathological lens that they're taking. I was thinking about ECPR and I called it neighborhood watch, but it's also sort of neighborhood listen instead of neighborhood watch, or maybe neighborhood witness, to witness someone's process. And I was thinking too about how with the ego death and the spiritual awakening, we need a larger map, because the ego compass keeps us in a certain area of the map, and when that breaks down, we now are going to be venturing into the outskirts of the map that we have not yet mapped, which are the unknown, and they can be a little bit scary, and they might be difficult to process because they might mean different things than the meaning that the ego would ascribe to those things. And I feel like the meaning maker is something to do with the collective and seeing the social fabric, because it's the ego that divides all of that up. I'm wondering if this context I'm creating with myself is making my nervous system strong, because lower energy words and ideas and thoughts make our nervous system weak. They weaken us. So by creating this context and using language that I choose, it's going to make my nervous system stronger. And I hope other people might do the same for themselves. And I was thinking about Dr. David Hawkins' scale of consciousness, and how below 200 is the level of force and makes us go weak, and above 200 is the level of power or integrity and makes us go strong. And I was thinking about, it could be that for me, working in the mental health system, the system makes me kind of angry, so it's making me weak. It's making me operate in a level of consciousness that is below the line of power. And so I would feel sort of angry, and that would make me go weak. And so it's not actually making my nervous system strong. And maybe part of it is that if our nervous system gets weakened, our body now has to make the biomolecules to make up for that loss in energy. So the nervous system has the energy channeling through it, makes us go weak. Now we have to make up biomolecules in order to hold us up, in order to it takes up our nutrition to make up for that loss of nervous energy. And I think too, it also secretes cortisol, which artificially makes us stronger to hold ourselves up a bit more. So the stress is actually part of the tension that we have in our muscles to hold ourselves up because our nerves aren't fully energized. And I think that makes a lot of sense, actually, and that could be related to how these lower states weaken us and waste our energy. And it could be partly how, as a person is going lower and lower on the levels of consciousness, when one is completing the entire map spectrum, it uses a lot of one's nutrients and strength to get through that. And actually, I'm thinking too that that could be one of the ways that gravity feels heavier, is that our body's so weak from wasting all the nutrients, from being so weak from being in those lower levels of consciousness. And I'm thinking to myself too, so many people say who are, for example, homeless, they start to adopt that posture of crouching on the side of the street. It could be partly because they're in that space of shame and they can barely stand up under the pressure of gravity. I would think that a lot of people who are homeless are in the state of shame, and it's very difficult to overcome the force of gravity. And that could be related to how I wrote down yesterday that there's the force of gravity and the field of consciousness, because I was thinking gravity is a field. It's the field of gravity. Then I was thinking, well, consciousness is a field too. So the field of consciousness must interact with the field of gravity somehow. And I think that's how it's related in a way. It's related in terms of Dr. David Hawkins' spectrum and scale of consciousness. So a person in the shame consciousness, it's one of the lowest levels of consciousness, is affected way more by gravity. And then they're in that posture. And so it's related to each other. And then a person above 200 would be in a different posture and able to withstand the force of gravity. And if a person sat in a shameful posture long enough, they would probably feel shameful. So it's not like, oh, go in that posture and you immediately feel shameful. But I think that's one of the ways that gravity almost forces us into that place. I think there's a relationship between that, because how one is holding themselves in the field of gravity affects one's state of consciousness. And we don't generally sense this. There could be some variables about how we sense this. So a person could actually be in the state of shame and crouching down. And that is gravity, position in gravity, and gesture of the body, the overall posture of the body being congruent with the consciousness, whereas somebody can be in a state of shame yet manage to be sort of in this proud posture. So the posture is not congruent with how one feels inside, but they're managing somehow. And then there could be a person who, I feel like sometimes with map consciousness, when I'm in that fluid state, if I crouch down, all of a sudden I feel ashamed. So it's correlated to that. Whereas I'm not necessarily, and then I stand up and I don't feel that anymore. Or I crouch down and I feel like a homeless person crouching down, but I'm just me. But it's this whole interplay between gravity and consciousness. So there's something about gravity, consciousness, light, and sound. It's all this movement. And so we can affect ourselves with our sound, with our, how we hold our body in space. I feel it's related to how our body is actually an instrument. Our voice, it vibrates through our whole body. It's not just about our lips or our voice box. It's about the whole shape of our body that creates our voice. And we could be giving the greatest speech ever, but if we're crouched over, it's not going to have the same effect as if we're upright. So how we hold ourselves is actually really important. And recently I've been purposely not being mindful of my posture when I'm sitting on the couch or something. I'm just kind of like, or whatever. And part of why I was not being mindful was because I realized I was sort of in a state where I was doing really well. So I didn't want to get into a place where I was flying too high. So I was sort of adjusting myself. But now that I'm starting to get into those states, or at least have a few thoughts come up that is trying to get me into that state of shame or guilt, I have to be very conscious and cautious of my posture. Because I remember sharing that one time I was in the hospital and I felt I was crouching and I felt worse. And I was on a medication I didn't want to be on. So I purposely had more pronounced posture to block gravity being congruent with my state of consciousness. So it doesn't mean it made all the shame and things go away, but at least gravity wasn't being congruent. I think that's part of what amplifies that, is if we are congruent with that. And I think about the power poses before. I watched a TED talk on that. And to me, that's just making up for how we normally are in ego consciousness, where we have this voice in our head talking about judgment, talking about anger, talking about jealousy, talking about all those things. And those are actually below the level of 200, which weaken our nervous system. And then we have to make these molecules and biochemicals to sort of strengthen us and hold us up, which probably creates like internal scar tissue and things, and warps the myofascia, and then we need something like rolfing to fix that. But the power poses is just changing one posture, changing how the body is held by gravity, changing the gesture. So they talk about putting your feet up on a desk and going like this, and do that for 5 minutes and you'll feel so much better. Well, crouch down like a homeless person and you'll feel worse. It's the same thing. And so sometimes when I'm in that state of map consciousness, of trance consciousness, when I crouch down, my body seems to make bodily associations and extrapolations, not just maybe shameful thoughts because I'm in a shameful posture, but I feel like I'm an actual homeless person. It's extrapolating to the people who take those postures and what they might feel like and how awful it is and how painful. And I also wrote down how this reflex of psychosis, I talked about the reflex of shaking one's hand when one burns one's hand, and how not only does it sort of dissipate the energy, the pain, the heat, it also signals to other people that we just hurt ourselves. And so they'll come and run to us. And so I feel like actually that the supposed symptoms of psychosis or mental illness, of say hearing voices or wandering down the street or crossing the street and not looking both ways, or dangerous behaviors or odd behaviors, are just the equivalent of, ouch, I'm in pain, I need somebody to help me. And I think that mechanism is an actual sign, not of personal illness, but look how many people that's happening to. Look how many people are burning inside and in so much pain that they just start acting in ways that might end their life, and then we take it seriously because it's so dangerous. But what it really calls for is love, patience, understanding, time, listening. It's, I think, also a mechanism not just for the person that's in the pain, but also people come, say 10 people are needed to get this person back into some kind of ability to be able to function or cope again. And so in a way, that one person helps mend social fabric, because otherwise we would just turn away and there would be no connection, there would be no empathy, there would be no care. But I still feel like just creating personal medical problem and giving chemical band-aids is not the answer. It calls for so much more love. Just like children being born on the autism spectrum call for so much more love. They need understanding, they need patience, all these things that a person going through a supposed mental health crisis need. And so, because people are behaving in strange ways, that is a symptom of something deeper, of disconnection, of lack of love. And so a person needs connection and love, not just being connected to chemicals. And if we break our physical structure, there's surgery to put us back together. But when our ego breaks, we try to put it back together with chemical band-aids, when what really mends the internal realm, the psyche, is love and understanding. This chemical ego band-aid is like trying to put a band-aid on our shadow, trying to give surgery to our shadow. It's not really going to do anything. It might make us forget we have a shadow. It's like if somebody breaks their arms and their legs, just giving them a pill for the pain, but not actually repairing the damage. And the damage can only be repaired by love and relationship and social connection. A lot has been done in the world to help create it to be more accessible for people with disabilities in physical movement, for example, or developmental disabilities in terms of however that works when somebody's born that way. And it seems like there's another class coming in of this kind of consideration needing to be taken for people, which is a different ability in consciousness. And this is sort of related to people that go through the transformation after having an ego structure formed through map consciousness and trans consciousness as so-called mental illness or mental health crisis. And then the children that are being born with a different lens of consciousness, with a different spectrum of what they make salient. And so I think it's designed so much for one type of human being to succeed, to supposedly succeed, and the rest are suppressed. And so not only is there developmental disabilities, which is probably a different kind of intelligence we'll never understand, and I actually think they're kind of like the frequency holders, and physical disability, either congenital or acquired in life. And it's the same with this difference in consciousness. It has to be understood, and the world needs to be created in a different way that allows for people with different consciousnesses, different ways of perception to flourish. Not just survive, but flourish. And so that would be including them in part of the redesign. And I'm thinking that our ego lens perception allows us to make salient a certain amount of information, and these children are being born with a different lens. They make different information salient. Different information is more prevalent for them, and it impresses upon them differently than us. And so they're going to be unfolding differently and creating a different world with their perceptual needs. And I think we have to go beyond just what they need to experiment with what they might need that we don't even know they need, and they don't know they need either. Just like years ago, people with serious mental illness diagnoses were thought they needed to be caged up. And then now people are allowed to be in the community but on meds and with different other resources. And maybe one day people won't be on meds, will be allowed to transform and take a different role and function as a different intelligence in society, because that is being squashed, because it's not understood, because people behave differently, because they're going through this transformation and they're not allowed to transform. There's very few people that manage to transform without being pathologized. And I don't think it's like a transformation, then it stops. It could be, but. And in the same way, these young children will be transforming, and they transform early. Oftentimes, they're on a supposed normal, regular trajectory of development, and then they hit 2 years old or something, and all of a sudden they start to appear to lose connection and go south. And I think part of it is that that's when this language learning gets revved up and turned on, and it fails to start for possible reasons I talked about before. And it's interesting, they don't acquire our language very easily, but they start to speak a different language, or experience a different language, or they are a different language. They have different gestures, they do different things, they play in a different way than children that develop with words. So they're regesturing reality just by virtue of being alive. I think this delay of language is trying to give this other consciousness, or this other element, this other aspect of consciousness, chance to take hold, which could be sort of the background in which the words arise. And the background is more important than the words. And I was thinking about how in fight or flight we have access to more bits of information. We also have access to more bits in manic consciousness. So if I have access to, say, 21 bits as opposed to 4, I'm going to be able to see which out of the 21 is more salient and go that way. In a way, I can see everything at the same time holistically, and then I move based on that holistic perception, which is kind of like collapsing the wave functions. I'm wondering if there's sort of like 16 bits, because that has something to do with the quantum computation. And so there's more degrees of freedom. And it feels like a rich experience